Hi, I'm Glenn Rogers, and this is Biblical Insights. The title of our video today is God and Government. And the question that we want to ask and at least try to answer is, does God in our world today select government leaders and put them in place? In other words, our presidents and prime ministers and kings and queens and that sort of whatever you call your government leaders here, we have a president in other countries, and I know many of my viewers are in Africa, many are in India, and you may have something other than a president. You may have a prime minister, or in some cases you may have a king. Okay, but the question is, whatever you call your government leader, is he God's anointed, or is she God's anointed? Did God put that person in place to do that job? And I think there's a lot of confusion about that, for some people at least. A few months ago, maybe 4 or 5 months ago, here in America, where I go to church, there was a man leading a prayer, and in the process of leading that prayer, he was commenting. He made the point in the prayer that many people are criticizing. He was talking to God, so he's saying, God, Lord, many people are criticizing your anointed leader, and we're sorry for that. You put him in place, and it's not our place to criticize him. And so I thought about that, and what he was actually saying is our current president, which this was a few months ago. This was in 2021, but it would be President Joe Biden. Okay, and he was saying that God put Joe Biden in office, and because he was God's anointed, we should not be criticizing him. And see, here in America, we don't feel bad about criticizing our political leaders. It's kind of a hobby for a lot of people. We're pretty serious about our politics, and if the leaders aren't doing what we think they should do, we criticize them. We talk about it. And this man was suggesting that we shouldn't do that because this leader was God's anointed. Now, my first thought was, well, where would he get an idea like that? And I think the obvious answer is from the Old Testament. God established the nation of Israel, and the nation of Israel, he called his people, and he had a covenant agreement with them. He said, I'll be your God, and you'll be my people. I will do this for you, and you will do this. You will obey my laws, and I will take care of you and bless you. And it was very much that the nation of Israel were God's people. And their form of government was called a theocracy. Okay, God ruled. And that was very much the case. He was the ruler of ancient Israel. Now, at some point, they said, yeah, but we'd like to have a king. All the other nations around us have a king, and they're laughing at us because we don't have a king, and so we want a king, right? You may have read the story. You may know it already quite well. But, God said, you're not going to like it. If you have a king, it's not going to be everything you think it is. You're not going to like. I'm sorry, we had a little bit of a glitch there. What I was saying is, God was saying to the people, you're not going to like having a king. It's not going to be what you think it is. You're not going to be happy with it. But they insisted. They said, no, we really want a king. So he said, okay, fine. And he selected the king, and it was Saul. And then Saul was replaced by David, and then David replaced by Solomon, and Solomon by Rehoboam, and so forth and so on. But even when they had a king, they were still a theocracy. Somebody might say, well, if you have a king, it's a monarchy. Well, yeah, okay. But in the case of Israel, it was still a theocracy. God was still in charge. And, he put kings in and he took kings out. And, so the question is, well, what about our countries today? Like America, for instance, or India, or one of the many countries in in Africa. Okay, like I used to live in Nigeria. Well, Nigeria has a president. Okay, whatever you call him, is that government leader, was that person put there by God because that country is God's and the government is God's and the rules are God's, and so he's running that nation and you have no right to criticize God. Is that the case? And I suggest to you that that is absolutely not the case. Okay, Israel was a very special case. Okay, God had called Abraham. He had made certain promises to Abraham. God fulfilled those promises to Abraham. And Israel existed for a very specific reason. They were going to be God's avenue of incarnation. He knew he was going to become a person in the form of Jesus. He was going to become a human being in the person of Jesus, and he wanted the group of people that Jesus would be a part of to be special people, to be his people, to know him in a way that other nations didn't know him, and who had laws that made them good and holy people if they obeyed them. They didn't always obey them, and sometimes they had to be punished, but they were still his special people. They existed for a special, unique purpose. They were different from every other nation that existed in the world. And there will never be another nation like Israel that come into existence as a result of the specific promise by God or from God, and have a specific purpose, such as they are going to be the people through whom he becomes a human being. You see, all that's already been accomplished. It's not going to happen again, right? Israel was a very specific group of people, and they were very much God's people. So let's ask the question, is America the same as Israel? Is America God's people? No. Is Nigeria God's people? No. Is India God's people? No. What about England? No. Germany? France? No. China? Japan? No. Okay, there is no nation on earth today that is God's nation, made up of God's people, like Israel used to be. There isn't one. Now, in every nation, there are people who are God's people. I'm one of God's people. You may be one of God's people. Okay? But we are not all in whatever country you live in. Everybody there is not one of God's people because the entire nation belongs to God. That just isn't the case. Does not happen today. That happened only once, only with Israel. And so when God was their king, or when he established a human king, he was still their God. They were still his people, and it was his specific nation. That is the nation of Israel. But this isn't the case in America. It's not the case in any country in Africa, any place else in the world. India, China, Japan, England, Germany. It just isn't the case. Okay? So what's the deal then with God and government? Does God have anything to do with government? Well, yes and no. It depends on what you mean. We learn in Romans 13 that God ordained government as something that should exist in the world to help manage and create orderly societies for people to live in. So the idea of government comes from God. God wants there to be governments. Does God set up and establish every government? No, of course not. Does he set up and establish any government? No. People do that. He did it once with Israel for a very specific purpose, but not anymore. People establish countries and governments. And we have to keep in mind that human beings, because we're created in God's image, and I say this a lot, but we have free will. We are self-determined. That just like God has free will and is self-determined, so are we. And so when it comes to forming a government and deciding whether we're going to be a direct democracy like ancient Greece was, or whether we're going to be a representative republic like America is, or whether we're going to have a parliamentary form of government, or whatever it is that we do, whatever the government is set up as in any given country, that's the people did that. Okay, the people did that. People have free will and they decide what they're going to do. Now, let me give you a very specific example. When we had our election here for back in 2020, or for the year 2020, it was a pretty close race between two candidates, and in the end, when all the votes were added up, there were about 80 million votes for Joe Biden. Okay, there weren't quite that many for Trump. Now, some people say there was some funny business going on there, and I don't know. It's over. It's done with. Biden is in office, so we're going to say he's the president. Okay, now 80 million people voted for him, and that's why he got elected. If you try to say, well, God did that, then what you're saying is that God made those 80 million people vote for Joe Biden. Really? Does God control people like that? So he makes them vote for a certain candidate so that in a democratic election, a specific candidate gets elected because God made all the people vote for that guy or that woman or whatever? No, it doesn't work that way. Okay? People were free to choose. For whatever reason, about 80 million of them voted for Joe Biden. Now, I didn't vote for him. I voted for the other guy. And if that other guy runs again, I'll vote for him again. Okay? I didn't vote for Biden. Wouldn't ever vote for Biden. But a lot of people did. So he's our president now. Okay? God didn't do that. The president, and it doesn't matter who it was, whether from George Washington, the first president, all down the line to Abraham Lincoln, maybe the greatest president, to Ronald Reagan or whoever, Trump, and now it's Biden. None of those guys, none of them, 45, 46 guys, were not selected and ordained by God. They were elected by the people in a free, democratic election, and the people were not coerced or manipulated in any way. They voted who they wanted to vote for. Okay? So there's no such thing today as God's anointed political leader. That is simply a myth. Somebody is taking what used to be the case for ancient Israel, and they're simply assuming that that's the way God still does things, and they think that God is in control of the government. Well, if God was in control of the government, why would he establish bad, evil governments who do bad, evil things? Why would God have put Hitler in power? You see, why would God have put the communists in power in a couple of different governments in the 20th century so that over 100 million people were either murdered or died horribly because of terrible circumstances as a result of wars and all this other stuff? Why would God have done that? God didn't do that. God doesn't control governments. The only people God controls are the ones who come to him and say, Lord, I'm making a mess of my life. I need your help. Please help me understand, and please help me do the right thing. Guide me, give me wisdom. See, then God helps those people. He doesn't really control them, but if they follow him, then they're taking his advice, his counsel. They're learning from him, and they're letting him lead them. Right? But does God simply control governments? No, he doesn't. He doesn't. And that's why sometimes people have to rise up and overthrow a bad government because the government's not doing its job. It's not taking care of the people properly. But God doesn't put government leaders in place today. That's us. And what we should do is pray to God for wisdom that we elect good leaders. And in those few countries where people don't get to elect a leader, but there are bad people who rise up and grab the power, and they are totalitarian dictators who do evil, ugly things, then we hope that somehow God will find groups of people within that country that will have the faith and the courage to rise up against those leaders and replace them with good men, good women who will do the right thing and be good leaders so their country and their people can prosper. See, that's what we want. We want to live in a world where there's peace and prosperity, where people can be happy, where they can help each other, and where we can achieve our potential as people who were created in God's image. And it's hard to do that when you have a bad government that's oppressive. See, we want freedom. And that's what people need. And that's why God gave us free will. That's why we need to be free, so we can exercise our free will and do good things. Well, I hope you found this helpful. I know it wasn't exactly the same kind of thing we normally do here, but I just felt like it was something we needed to talk about today. So, as always, I would encourage you, read your Bible, pray, go to church, and may God bless.